Good morning. Before we begin, let me remind you that you should all be, I'm not entirely sure what this is called, but registered in Moodle. Okay? If you go to the course page from your SRS pages, okay, you're going to see a little button that says Moodle. You should click it, and then you'll be able to receive the Moodle messages and be able to do whatever that has to be done there. That's one. So do your Moodle thing. Fascinating. And you should also do your Turnitin thing. The Turnitin thing is, as you know by now, how you submit your homeworks. Okay? And it would be terrible if you waited till 11:50 on Monday and your homework is ready and great, and then you try to do this and figure out that, ooh, you should have done something earlier. Okay? So make sure that you're able to do both of these. There's one more bit of class information that I should have given you on Monday, and I forgot. If you all look there, you're going to see a gentleman with a camera. Okay? Some of you may have noticed this. This class is being videotaped. And if I do a good enough job and if you behave, which surely you will, but it's not very clear that I will do a good enough job, the university wants to put the class on the web for the world to see. Okay? And just to be clear, this is not going to happen within this semester. Okay? So you can't say, oh, I'm going to sleep Monday morning and then I'm going to wear my pajamas in the evening and watch the class. Okay? If you want to see the class, you should be here. Good. Now, our object of affection, the gross domestic product. What does this measure? Okay, no mumbling, just speak up. What is the GDP? Yes, ma'am. Very good. Total monetary value of final goods and services. Say it in your words. I'm sure when you think of this, you don't think of the total monetary value of goods and services, right? So, what is it?
In a certain period, countries, yeah, it has to be developed by a very historical.
Blah, blah, blah. But what is it? How much we produce. Okay? That's what it is, right? The GDP is the answer to the question, how much did this country produce? Okay? The question is extremely simple. It's a very well-defined question. And it has a very proper answer, right? All we're saying is, well, we produce a boatload of different things. We can't keep track of each one of them, so we turn them into values. But this is the answer to the question, how much do we produce? Now, whenever say we, okay, the first thing you should ask is, who are we? This is, of course, a deep question in many respects, right? You should think of this as a sociological and an anthropological question as well. But from the economist's perspective, we could think of at least two types of we. One is we who live in this country, okay? The other one is we, who carry the Turkish passport or the Turkish national identity card. And those two we's don't have to be the same people, right? Is it only the Turkish people who do production in Turkey? No, right? Let's ask the other question. Do Turkish people do production only in Turkey? No. Okay? So what are we measuring? Which one is this? Okay, so the domestic there says this is a production that takes place within our borders. Okay, we don't care who produces. What we care is where this is produced. This is a better measure for policy purposes too, because this is what we get to control, right? When the Turkish Central Bank does monetary policy, when the Turkish government says, I'm going to give you investment subsidies, right? These are all things that are related to what happens inside this country, okay? This is what we get to affect. Now, the other question, how much do the Turks produce, okay? And I'm using this Turk in the most inclusive sense you could think of. In general, the answer to that is, well, we don't know, okay? Are there Turkish people doing production in, I don't know, New Zealand? Yeah, I know the answer is yes, okay? How much do they produce? I don't know. How would I know? Okay, it's kind of an interesting question actually, right? You know, what is the Turkish contribution to the world GDP? Okay, but there's no way of knowing the answer to that question. And apart from being kind of interesting for curiosity purposes, it's not a very useful question either. Okay, however, we could ask the other interesting question, which is, well, there is a production of the Turks outside the country, of which the proceeds, the income, is transferred back into Turkey. Okay? Now that's something that we care. So this is something especially important for our country because we have a lot of people working in Germany, Belgium, France, right? Yes, sir. I can speak up. All right. So this is no longer the big rage, right, that it was in the 70s and the 80s, but you've all heard Almanca, okay? The Turkish people who went to Germany, who are working there, but importantly, the people who still have family here, the people who send money to their families in Turkey, okay? Now we're talking about production that takes place in Germany, but income that accrues to Turkey, income that gets spent in Turkey, okay? So that's not a bad question to answer, right? How much do the people inside Turkey get to spend? Okay, how much of the income is usable by the people in Turkey, okay? It should be clear to you that if somebody does production in Germany, okay, me as the Turkish Statistical Agency, I have no way of knowing this. If that income is transferred into Turkey, that I observe, I can count those, okay? If a Japanese firm does production in Turkey, I see that. That's in the GDP. If the profits of that firm is transferred back into Japan, I see that too, okay? And I care. What is the difference? Do the Turkish people doing production outside Turkey, is their transfers into Turkey larger than the transfers of foreigners doing production in Turkey, the income of which gets transferred out, okay? The answer to that net question, I said this in a complicated way, but it's something simple, okay? The production, the income that gets transferred into Turkey from outside minus the income that gets generated in Turkey but is transferred out, okay? If you add one to the GDP and subtract the other one, what you find is the gross national product. This is the one that you hear all the time. Gayri safi milli hasıla. Gayri safi yurt içi hasıla. Gayri safi milli hasıla. Now in the 1980s, most of the 1990s, even in the early 2000s, okay, there were a lot of Turkish people doing production outside the country. Many, right? Mostly workers, but some entrepreneurs too. And there were very few foreigners doing production inside Turkey, sending money out. That meant we took our GDP, okay, and then added a lot of income to that came from abroad, okay, and did not subtract much because nobody other than Turks did production in Turkey. So our GNP used to be a lot higher than our GDP. That's why politicians love to talk about this one rather than this one. And that's why you think of the gayri safi milli hasıla, the GNP, because you heard of this all the time, okay? This is not a very useful measure, right? Because, our GNP is high because, Turks in Belgium felt especially benevolent this year and sent a lot of money to their grandmothers. Good, great, okay? Now, is this a policy success? Have we done something right? Okay, so this is, from the policy perspective, this is not a very useful question. From a welfare perspective, it is not a bad question, right? Because we get to say, oh, okay, you know, people living in this country, not country, living in this town, this little place, right? They don't produce much, but they are not hungry because they get income from abroad. Fine. Okay? So you should know what this is, but you should understand that this is the object of interest. We care about the gross domestic product. How much production takes place within our borders? Okay? Now the great question becomes, how does just one measure this? Okay? And it is hard, right? There are two ways of doing this. Calculation of the GDP by expenditure. Okay? I'm going to tell you what these are. By income and by value added. Here's the deal. You're going to see this very often this semester. We're going to call GDP, we're going to denote the GDP with Y. Okay? GDP equals. Now we're going to ask by expenditure. The first way of thinking about GDP is, if we produce this, we must have done something with it. Okay? This thing must have gone somewhere. So let's look at where the things have gone. Okay? Let's look at how we use these things. Let's add up the ways we use them. The sum must give us what we produced. Kind of makes sense, right? If I produced it, it has to be somewhere. Let me look at where these are, what I did with these, okay, and add them up. So what do we do with our production? Really easy question. You should be able to. Yeah, okay, we eat it. When you and I eat it, when you and I use it, it's called consumption. Okay? This is by far the largest share of the GDP. Okay? Most of the GDP in Turkey and elsewhere is consumed. Why is that? Well, this is the purpose of production, right? We produce because we want to use things. And in particular, we want to use things to get utility out of them. We get utility when we consume things. Okay? Consumption. But, I mean, we don't eat everything, right? I mean, we're not grasshoppers. Okay? So, what else? Okay, so some of them are exported, right? We produce them, but other people eat them. Okay? Fair. There is a historically accepted sequence of writing these things up, so I'm going to come to exports. Okay? So consumption is obvious. Exports are also obvious. Okay? What else? The government uses some of them, right? This is important because it's again used up, but it's not used up by you. You don't choose what to do with it. The government says, you know, I'm going to keep a military, and I'm going to feed these guys potatoes. Okay? When those potatoes are bought, is it your consumption? No. It's the government consumption. Okay? What else? A key one is investment. Okay? And it's very important to understand that the word investment means something entirely different to economists than it means to the average person on the street, the journalist or whatever. Okay? When you hear the word investment, what comes to your mind is buying up shares, using savings, blah blah, right? Yatırım yapmak. Arçelik hisselerine yatırım yaptım. Okay? I invested in Arçelik shares. That is not investment. Okay? Well, that's not investment for our purposes. Investment is when Arçelik says, I'm going to build a factory. Okay? Something physical appears. Because I'm asking, what happened to the GDP Okay? Now, when you are saying, well, I used my... Which good are we producing today? Come on. Suggest a good. What? Antifreeze. Excellent. All right, so we're the people who produce and eat and drink antifreeze, and then we all die. We are the antifreeze economy, okay? Everything happens with antifreeze. Now, we do production. I get my share of the antifreeze, okay? We're looking at the expenditure. You have an antifreeze factory that is built with antifreeze and is producing antifreeze. This is a terrible example, right? So the economist's favorite good in this respect is either mushrooms, okay? Because you can eat them and you can use them to produce more mushrooms, right? We're clever people, we find these things. My favorite example, I'm not a mushroom person, is potatoes. Why? Because, you know, it's a consumption good, it's also an investment good. Produce them, eat them, consumption, great. Give it to the government, government spending, great. Give it to Germans, exports, great. Right? Bury them under the ground, it's investment because they're going to produce more potatoes next year. And that is the definition of investment, okay? Using the goods and services to do more production later, all right? Now, when I buy Arçelik shares, is this investment by my definition? Does that turn to more production later? It's just a readjustment of ownership, right? That Arçelik factory was already there. Somebody owned it. Somebody had shares of it, okay? That's what shares are. You own a fraction of that factory, essentially. I come to you and say, I'd like to buy your shares, okay? You sell me the shares. Did anything happen to the factory? No, okay? Some of you may have noticed this is your homework question. Transfer of the ownership of something that already exists does nothing to the GDP. Have we produced something? No, okay? When is it investment? When I say, I'm going to expand this factory, I'm going to put one more machine in this, okay? Then I'm doing investment. So GDP is consumption plus investment, okay? Plus government spending plus exports. Don't ask me why exports are not E but X, okay? This is how economists do this. Later we're going to use the E for exchange rate. Now, there are two problems with this definition, with this way of measuring the GDP. Let's first ask, let's go for the obvious one first. We said everything that is produced must be used somehow, okay? Let's add up the ways that they are used and come up with the total production, okay? Good. So we're going to look inside the country, we're going to sample people, right? We're going to ask them, how much did you consume? How much did you invest? We're going to ask the government, how much did you use? We're going to ask the exporters, how much did you export? Yes, sir. Don't worry about this for the moment. Okay? We're going to come to that. For a moment, let's be in a tax-free economy. Okay? But even if with taxes, okay, the answer is nothing. Because we're adding up the values of stuff. Okay? Those are, if some of the prices, well, okay, I'll come back to that later. It's not too hard, but let me not break my train of thought now. Now, my problem here is the following. Did you consume this year? Yes. You wouldn't be alive otherwise. Okay? Now, if I ask you how much did you consume, you'd give me a number, right? 1,000 liras worth of stuff. And I'd write down 1,000 for consumption. Okay? Was all of your consumption on goods and services produced in Turkey? No. Okay? So when I'm adding up these consumption numbers, I'm just doing that, right? How much did you consume? This much. Write down. How much did you consume? That much. Added that. Okay? How much did I consume? This much. Add that. Okay? You know, but did anyone eat pineapples this year? Yes. So pineapples is a good that I'm sure that we don't produce. Okay? This country does not produce pineapples, ananas. All right? Nonetheless, some people tend to like it. And it's available in our country, and you can eat that. And it's in your consumption. Is it in our GDP? No. What is the problem here? The problem is, just like we export, we also import. Okay? And when we look at consumption, okay, we have to do one of two things. Either we're going to ask people, what was your consumption of goods and services produced in Turkey? What was your investment using only goods and services produced in Turkey? Okay? And do that and calculate that. That will give us the GDP. It should be immediately obvious to you that there's no way of doing this. Because while it's possible to calculate your consumption, if somebody came to you and asked you, what was your consumption of Turkish goods and services, oftentimes you don't even know whether something you're buying is made in Turkey or not. Okay? So this has to be your total consumption, total investment, total government spending, total exports, but using the stuff that is produced in Turkey and the stuff that we imported. So how are we going to get to our GDP definition? How are we going to make this only the stuff that is produced in Turkey? You're clever people. If we subtract imports, we'll be saying, look, I know what the total spending is on Turkish goods and foreign goods. But I also know the value of the foreign goods that entered the country. If I take that out, the remainder has to be the Turkish goods. Okay? This is called net exports. And this is something that you're going to see like a zillion times this year. Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay? So let me say this once again, because it's important that this is very clear to you guys. GDP by expenditure, and this is a very useful definition. If you go to the statistical agencies, well, it's no longer called that, the TÜİK's webpage, okay, you can find Turkish GDP calculated this way. Okay? You could ask you the question, in different years, what fraction of our GDP was used for consumption, for investment, for government spending, whatnot. Okay? What we're doing is we're saying, let's look at the spending. Let's look at the expenditure. Consumption expenditures, investment expenditures, government expenditures, and exports. These are all things that were produced. But they all contain things that we imported as well. Let's take that out. The remainder is our GDP. Yay, well done. Okay? This is GDP by expenditure. Here is the problem. This assumes everything that we produce, well, it doesn't, but you will have this question at some point. It seems to assume that everything that we produce this year is used this year. What if they're not? What if I produce a jacket and it's not sold this year? Is it in the GDP? Sure. It's produced. It's there. Right? The whole point was to measure production. But where is it? Why? So you should have a feeling that if it's going to be somewhere, this is the only place it could be. But why? Okay? Obviously it's not consumption because nobody bought this. Okay? Obviously it's not government spending because the government didn't buy it either. Obviously it's not net exports because we did not export it. I produced it, I put it in my warehouse, okay, my depot, it's just staying there. Now, in what way is it, and the answer is yes. We're going to count this in as investment, okay? So our investment actually has two components. One is the physical machinery, factories, stuff, okay? The other one is what is called, this is a good word to learn, inventory, stock. The things that you produced and you're keeping in your warehouse, in your depot, in the back room. The thing that you produced, but you haven't yet sold, okay? What we have in investment is the physical investment itself plus changes in the inventory, okay? Not the level of the inventory itself. Because remember, okay, so you should know this from your 101. And this is going to be something extremely important in our class. The distinction between flow variables and stock variables. Flow variables are things that are measured per unit of time. My salary is a flow variable, right? I earn this much when? Every month, okay? Salary is a flow variable. It's 1,000 liras per month, right? My wealth, my total savings is a stock variable. I have 5,000 liras in the bank. When? Now. I don't have 5,000 liras in the bank per month, right? A stock variable is, as the name suggests, something that is measured at a particular point in time, okay? A flow variable is something that is measured over an interval of time, okay? Now, is the GDP a stock variable or a flow variable? It's a flow variable, right? It's the GDP produced over the course of the year, in this quarter, okay? Over time. What about inventory? Are inventories a flow variable or a stock variable? This is a stock variable, right? So we're not adding these two up. What we're doing is we're saying, let's take the change in the inventory. Now it's a flow variable. The change in the inventory over this year. Why does this make sense? Think of the following. This is the easiest. Let's say we started with 0 inventories, okay? No stocks whatsoever. We did production. At the end of the year, we look at the inventories again and find that Turkish firms have 1,500,000 liras worth of inventories now, okay? So beginning of the year is 0. End of the year is 1.5 million, okay? How much of this goes into the GDP? The whole, right? What we're saying is, look, we looked at the inventories at the beginning of the year, there was nothing, okay? We look at the inventories at the end of the year, 1.5 million liras worth of stuff are there, okay? Where did these come from? We produced them. Well, that's the whole point. Goes into the GDP. Okay? What if at the beginning of the year we didn't have 0? We had, say, 500,000 liras worth of inventories. Then we're saying, look, at the beginning of the year we already had 500,000 liras worth of stuff in the inventories. At the end of the year we had 1.5 million. Okay? So the difference is 1 million, and that million has to have come from somewhere. Where? Well, we produced it. Okay? Goes into the GDP. And we're going to count this in investment. This is something that's going to be very important this year and next year. For the following reason. We see the reverse as well. Okay? It could have been, at the beginning of the year, we had 3.5 million. At the end of the year, we had 1.5 million. Could this happen? Sure. We had mountains of stocks, things that we produced earlier but didn't sell. At the end of the year, it turned out we sold some of that. Okay? What is the GDP contribution? Minus 2 million. Excellent. What is happening here now? What is happening is the following. We're saying, look, I observe consumption. Okay? This guy ate a lot, bought a lot of clothes, had a lot of massages and haircuts, right? Consumption is high. Now, it turns out some of the stuff he bought were imported. Take those out. It also turns out some of the stuff he bought were produced last year. Should that be in the GDP? It is consumption, but remember the definition. What are we trying to measure? How much did we produce this year? Okay? I manufactured the jacket. I'm trying to sell this. Okay? I manufactured this in 2008. Couldn't sell it. Right? This guy came. He's a nice guy, and I'm a bad salesman, so I told him, oh, this is, this year's fashion. Right? Sold it. In 2009. Is the jacket in 2008 GDP or 2009 GDP? 2008, right? Because we're looking at production. Okay? But is it in 2008 consumption or 2009 consumption? Something is wrong here. Okay? This jacket should not be in 2009 GDP, but it is in 2009 consumption. I have to subtract it somehow. Where is it coming out of? The inventory is declined by one jacket. I'm taking that out. Okay? If at the beginning of the year you had 3.5 million liras worth of inventories, at the end of the year you had 1.5 million liras worth of inventories, what we're saying is, apparently 2 million liras worth of stuff that were consumed, invested, used by the government, or exported were actually produced earlier. I should take those out. That's what it is. Okay? When the economy goes badly, when the economy slows down, and we're going to have precise definitions of what that means, the economy slowing down. But for the moment, just pretend that you understand. Okay? When it's, say, late 2008, okay, you understand that, or things are not good. The first thing that happens is factories slow down production. Okay? They slow down production more than people slow down their consumption and investment and the government spending. Okay? What happens often, this is not every single time, but oftentimes what happens is they sell their inventories. Okay? If you know that unemployment is high, people are unhappy, they don't want to consume, they don't want to invest, do you want to produce? If nobody's going to buy your stuff, are you going to produce? That's rather easy. Okay? You don't produce. The GDP contribution is small, right? However, some people still continue to consume. Some people still do investment. Well, all people still continue to consume, but at less amounts oftentimes. Some people still do investment. Government still functions. We still have some exports. Okay? Where are these coming out of? Your inventories. Okay? You try to get rid of your inventories as quickly as possible. So at the end of a bad period, a recession, okay, inventories are low. For example, now, right? We're coming, hopefully, to the end of a deep recession in our country. Inventories are low. Now, your producers, you're all thinking, this recession is ending. People haven't consumed much for a year and a half, right? Do they have a desire to consume now? Yes, they want to buy stuff. Investment has been low. Will people want to invest now? Because investment is things like the following. You had a factory. You have a machine that you use to do production, right? Machines have finite lives. You use it 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. Then you have to change it, okay? Now, this was the machine that was used for 5 years. The year is 2008. Are you going to change that machine? It's a crisis year, okay? In general, you're going to say, nah, we're not going to do much production anyway. Let's not do the investment now. Let's not spend the money on this, replacing this machine now. I'm going to do this when I know I'm going to do production. For example, these days, hopefully, okay? Investment is going to shoot up. Consumption is going to shoot up, okay? What the producers will do is to say, well, we have to have the goods ready. When people want to buy, they must find goods to buy, okay? So production takes off. often this happens before consumption shoots up and investment shoots up. Okay? So when you look at the GDP statistics, what you see is GDP has increased, but consumption hasn't increased. Physical investment in goods, production goods, machinery, factories has not increased. Government spending has not increased. Okay? Net exports have not increased, but GDP has increased. Invariably, you're going to see this in newspapers, right? People begin to say things like, the government is lying. They're forcing the statistical office to, put out bullshit GDP numbers so that people are going to feel good. The statistical office says we have produced a lot, but it is not consumed, it's not invested, not exported. What has happened to this? Okay? This is what happened. This is production for inventory. And oftentimes people do this on purpose, right? Your average firm says, I would like to have 100,000 liras worth of inventories, okay? In general. In a crisis year, they draw down their inventories. They don't produce much, and they sell their inventory. You have 20,000 liras worth of inventories. Once you realize that you're getting out of the recession, you want to build up to your normal inventory level again, okay? So you see a lot of production, not much of it going to these. I am betting this is going to happen this year, right? Good. And your book is a good source to read on these things. These are not difficult stuff. This is GDP by expenditure. And you can immediately see why this is something useful, right? We're able to say, what happens to the stuff that we produce? What drives our production? Are we producing so that people will consume? Are we producing so that others will consume? Are we producing so that we're going to produce more later? Are we producing so that the government is going to provide services? Okay? These are useful questions. And part of your homework is, well, this week and next week is going to be finding these numbers and making sense of those. Okay? There's one iffy point here. That is coming up with the government's production contribution. Now, let's go back to the initial definition. What is the GDP? The GDP measures the monetary value of our production. Okay. But for something to have a monetary value, I have to know the unit value, right? I have to know the price. That means that thing must have been bought and sold in markets so that there is a price, so that I can turn it into a value. Okay? Do everything have a price? That's not entirely clear. I'm going to assert that this 102 lecture is a production of a service, and hopefully you will agree. And if you don't, then this is a major waste of your time. Right? You are receiving a service now. What is the price? So there is a price, kind of, for the whole university education, right? You're paying a tuition. But that tuition isn't quite the right tuition, quite what the price would be. So I could have said, like in ancient Greece, I'm going to come up here, I'm going to talk about introduction to macroeconomics. Whoever wants to learn can come, but you have to pay me. Here's my ball, you have to put a little money in it. Okay? Now if I did that, I am fairly sure the Turkish Statistical Agency would be delighted. Okay? Because here is the production of the service, we know exactly what the price is. Okay? We know exactly what the GDP contribution is. But we don't. So this is a difficult case. What do we do with the GDP contribution of this lecture? Even more difficult. Let's say you're sick. You go to SSK dış kapı hastanesi, right? Some doctor takes care of you. Okay? How much do you pay? There's a reason why this is the SSK dış kapı hastanesi and not MESA. The answer in general is nothing. Okay? In state hospitals, you pay next to nothing. Even better. Did you sleep last night? Did you sleep well? Well, I mean, you knew that you had to come here in the morning, and that kind of sucks, but You slept. You didn't fear that, the Bulgarians are going to attack us and they're going to show up in your door and whatever, right? Your country is protected. We have an army. Is that a service or a good? It's a service. How much did you pay for that service? Is that service a worthless, valueless service? No. And in fact, our country has a huge, massive army. We spent enormous resources on that thing, okay? What is the GDP contribution? I mean, that guy is better be producing some service, okay? But how do we value that service? The answer turns out to be, we really can't do this, okay? Because we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, now I'm going to have an auction of the protection of the army. Let's see how much you're going to pay for this, okay? So what we do is, things like these, especially the government services, are valued at cost, okay? The army's contribution to the GDP is what we spend on the army. A judge's contribution to the GDP is his salary. We're saying the value of this guy's service is what we're paying for it. We know this is not right. We know that if there were a market for this service, the value would be a lot higher than that. The price would be a lot higher than that, okay? But we can't know what it is. So in Turkey, in the US, in Germany, in Japan, we value a lot of the services, and especially all of the government services, at cost. Okay? Good. Now what you should do is take 5 minutes off and be here in exactly 5 minutes. Meanwhile, if you want the syllabus, there are some copies here.